Hi, everyone. Welcome to week 3 of biogeography. I hope your week has gone well. Let's get started. I wanted to go over some of the answers from the first question of the week, the question in which I asked you all if you were traveling to a planet outside of our solar system, what would be 5 things that you would bring with you? I read through the answers and a lot of really interesting ones, and just wanted to cover some of the common things that you all said. So one of the most there here are the 5 of the most common things: a knowledgeable friend, a firearm or some form of protection, water filtration, a camera to document new species, and food. And I think those answers were really telling and really interesting, and hopefully helped orient you to the activity for this past week on identifying a species that you may not have known before. But I think these common answers represent some of the essentials that any human being would want to have going into a new area. So a fun exercise to think about and to reflect on. So let's get started with this week's lecture. We're going to be talking about evolution and the basics of evolution. And so, in addition to talking about some of the finer details, I also want to keep this wide view of what exactly evolution is and what we're going to be talking about. And so, we'll remember that there were two biogeographers, Al Dove and Chuck D. Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, who came up with the theory of, or then it was a hypothesis of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And that wording is really important because evolution, as we'll see, happens with multiple different mechanisms, or different mechanisms. And natural selection is just one of those things. But oftentimes natural selection gets conflated with evolution. So to put that another way, not all evolution happens by natural selection, but natural selection is a process of evolution. And so these two biogeographers, scientists, were really important for biological understanding of how life changes over time. And as I mentioned in the last lecture, they both came up with their hypothesis, now a theory, independently. They traveled literally in opposite directions from Western Europe to catalog species and explore new environments. So they were both world travelers. They collected a lot of specimens, but Wallace is actually the more important person for the formal field of biogeography, because many of his ideas still hold today, and he did more than just come up with the theory of evolution by natural selection, which is a huge idea, not to minimize it, but his work encompasses more than just evolution by natural selection. So these two individuals are really important for the formal understanding of what evolution is within the scientific community. And so they're really important to bring up. And actually, the picture of the person at the beginning of last week's lecture is Alfred Russel Wallace. So that's what he looked like. Okay, so as time has gone on, the debate about evolution continues. This is a cover picture of the cover of Time magazine in 2005, so 15 years ago. But when I was finishing up undergrad, the debate of evolution and where its place was within public education in the United States was very hotly contested. This day and age, this is less of a contentious issue, although those who oppose studying evolution or talking about evolution within public schools or just sort of in general are still very entrenched in those ideas. So it's important, as you're learning about this theory, to understand it not only from its scientific merits within the realm of science, but also how it's perceived and talked about outside of the realm of science. And so there's some things that are really important to realize, that there is no debate within the scientific community about whether or not the theory of evolution by natural selection, or that evolution is something that we can accept as fact. Okay. A number of years ago, and maybe even still today, there is this claim that scientists don't agree on evolution. And that's not exactly, that's not true. Scientists debate and talk about the evidence that supports evolution and whether or not certain bits of evidence support evolution or not. But whether or not the theory itself, the hypothesis itself, is one that has a large body of evidence to support it is not a debate. Okay, and so if you hear someone saying that there's a debate within the scientific community about evolution, which really is the person who says that implying that there's a debate about the legitimacy of the theory, then that's not correct. So the theory of evolution is accepted as scientific fact because of the overwhelming evidence to support it. Now, individual bits of evidence are debated, are scrutinized, but the body of evidence that supports this theory is overwhelming. Okay, and then so the discussion about evolution kind of, moves in different directions. And one of the other common things that people say, and that maybe even some folks in this class say, is that, well, I don't believe in evolution. And, that's cool. And I'll tell you why that's not particularly bothered by that idea. First, in recalling our last lecture about different ways of knowing, there are different ways of knowing, right? And so it's important to remember what science is in these discussions about evolution. And remember that science is an evidence-based way of knowing. All right, that's one part of it, but that's not the whole part of it. The other part, as you will remember, is that that evidence requires a widely accepted medium of understanding. And so what science relies on for people to chew on the ideas is logic and reasoning, which is something that all human beings possess, that tool, right? It's something that we can kind of think of as our software that we come with right out of the factory, right? This way of understanding and making sense of the world, logic and reasoning. Now, there are other ways of knowing that we develop that are deeply culturally embedded or experientially embedded. But logic and reasoning is one of those skills that human beings come kind of hardwired with, all right? And that's what science relies on, and that's where the evidence is discussed within that realm. And so it requires very little context. So going beyond, this idea of I don't believe in evolution, first of all, it's, that's fine if that is a position that you have. And so, but the other part of this is that evolution, because it's a scientific way of knowing, it doesn't require belief, right? When we're talking about belief systems, we're talking about that deeply contextual, culturally relevant, experientially relevant way of knowing. And so evolution doesn't require our belief because it is a scientific way of knowing that relies on our ability to reason and understand things based on a quality of the way that our mind works that all human beings have. And so this statement is somewhat invalid in that the use of the word believe in conjunction with evolution already attempts to take evolution outside of the realm of science. Okay, and so, in this class or in any sort of discussion about evolution, it's not about whether or not you believe in the theory. It's not about whether or not you believe in the evidence. It's about accepting or rejecting the evidence. And it's perfectly fine to reject the evidence of evolution, the evidence that supports the theory of evolution. That's perfectly fine if you look at things like the fossil record and you look at things like DNA evidence and you say, I just reject that as evidence that supports this theory. Then that's fine. But it's important to know what is being rejected and what isn't, what is being rejected and what isn't being rejected. And so For the purposes of this class, you're going to be tested on how well you understand evolution as it's lined out as a theory, not whether or not you accept the evidence or not. And that's a really important point. You doing well in this class, you answering questions on exams, and then in your further discussions about evolution, doesn't require your belief, right? Because again, that's taking evolution outside of the realm of science. It requires you to accept or reject the evidence. And oftentimes what you'll hear in these discussions about evolution, and particularly when somebody, doesn't feel comfortable with the theory of evolution, they're oftentimes not talking about the evidence. They're not talking about whether or not they accept or reject the evidence. They're talking about how they understand the theory of evolution makes them feel within their deeply contextual way of knowing in the world. And again, that's perfectly valid if, the theory of evolution makes you uncomfortable. It's perfectly valid if it makes you upset. But it's important to understand what that theory is answering, what questions they're answering. And it's fine for you to reject it. But we are going to understand what the theory says. And I'm going to try to do a good job of putting boundaries and parameters on what evolution is attempting to, or not attempting, but what evolution is saying about life and about humanity. Because oftentimes people end up disagreeing with evolution, either misunderstanding what the evidence to support it is actually saying, or just even understanding the theory itself. Okay, and so around this time in the early 2000s, there was this sort of counter hypothesis with intelligent design. And of course, various creation stories have existed as long as human beings have existed. And so, particularly with intelligent design, that hypothesis was used as a counter to the theory of evolution. But in examining both of these categories of ways of knowing and explaining life and how life evolves or how life changes over time, neither of those ways or none of those ways are scientific ways of knowing. Intelligent design, which we're not really going to cover in this class, requires the crux of that hypothesis is neither testable or falsifiable. And of course, with creation stories, they also are not testable or falsifiable. And again, I want to keep making this point that that's okay. It's okay to have explanations for anything that are not scientific. There's a certain utility to those ways of knowing that science and evolution do not exist in, and vice versa. There are limitations to both of them. But it's important to make the distinction about what we're talking about, okay? So it's fine to not accept evolution. It's not really scientifically valid to say you don't believe in evolution. But we'll try to keep the boundaries very clear when we're talking about these things. Okay, so I asked you to define evolution, and I will. I'm recording this lecture actually on Friday, and so I'll give you some statistics on what the different definitions for evolution that you all gave in next week's lecture. But the definition of evolution, the scientific definition of evolution, is actually really kind of boring and technical. So the definition of evolution as defined by science is a change in allele frequencies within a specific population over time. All right. And, I think that probably many of you all didn't define evolution this way. And it sort of begs the question of why is this such a contentious topic? Well, of course, evolution, as people understand this theory, has been used to explain a lot of different things. And some of those things are valid explanations, but some of them are not. And some people have used evolution to describe how life began. And in fact, evolution doesn't do that, as you can see from this evolution, or as you can see from this definition. Evolution is simply a way of explaining how life proceeds. It doesn't attempt to explain how life came into being. And, science can't really do that at this point. In evolution, the theory of evolution is not attempting to do that. It's talking about after life appears, what happens and how it changes. And so this definition, how the change in allele frequencies within a specific population over time, is talking about the ways in which different traits, alleles, within a population, so not an entire species, but just a particular specific population, change over time. So we're talking about the evolution of eye color, which is an allele, which is a trait of a particular gene in a population, might change over time, right? And so, we can have a population of dogs, let's say, and they start out with having the overwhelming number of dogs in that specific population have green eyes. And let's say over time, environments change or the population changes, and now the majority of individuals in that population have blue eyes. That is essentially the evolution, right? A change in allele frequencies. And sometimes those allele changes can be relatively minor, like a change in eye color, or they could be, much more involved. That would result in, the evolution of hominids, right? A suite of allele frequency changes in a population over time. Okay. And so all of the diversity in life, in particular species, in populations that we observe is due to changes in allele frequencies. In looking in human beings, the difference in the height of human beings, the difference in eye color, skin color, hair texture, all of these things are the result of changes in allele frequencies. All human beings have genes for eye color and all these different physical traits, but we all don't look the same. And that's the result of us having different alleles, different combinations of different genes. And so new species arise from ancestral species, right? Homo sapiens evolved from previous hominid species that were on the planet, as did all other species. And then similar species share a recent common ancestor. And so, speaking of the ways in which evolution gets misunderstood and misrepresented, oftentimes you'll see a graphic of the evolution of human beings, which is depicted here. And I absolutely hate this drawing, because what it implies and what people have taken up is that human beings evolved from chimps. And many times you'll hear people who disagree with evolution saying, like, humans didn't evolve from chimps, or if humans evolved from chimps, how are chimps still around? And there's just a lot of misunderstanding that we'll clear up in the next two lectures about this. But the reason why this graphic here is really problematic is that it implies this sort of like linear evolution and one line of species branching from another species, sort of like a relay race. And that's not how evolution works. And in fact, human beings and chimpanzees and bonobos we all evolved from a common ancestor. And so chimpanzees, modern day chimpanzees, have been evolving over time in parallel to the different hominid species, as well as bonobos. So this graphic is really problematic and does not do a good job of describing human evolution, and is one of the reasons why evolution is really misunderstood. Okay, so humans, we didn't evolve from apes. Humans are apes, and we'll talk about sort of these biological definitions for different things. And so a better way to represent hominid evolution and human beings' relationship to apes or to other apes is to take a look at this graphic here, which is a phylogenetic tree. And as you can see from this tree here, this organism towards the base of the tree is a common ancestor that human beings, bonobos, chimpanzees, gorillas all share. So we all have a common ancestor that we evolved from. In very similar, an analogy to this would be, your fourth cousin in your family, or your third cousin in your family. You all weren't born from the same mother and father, but you were born from the same great 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 grandparents, right? And so you have a common ancestor, but your relatedness is more distant in present day. Okay, so that's one bit of understanding that's really important. All right, so let's talk about the evidence for evolution, right? This is at the crux of whether or not one accepts or rejects the evidence that supports the theory of evolution, this idea that new species arrive from ancestral species, that they share common ancestors, and that all of this change is due to changes in allele frequencies. And so there's lots of evidence to support evolution. In the fossil record, there is lots of evidence. And here's one bit of evidence that is that's very popular, that's really important to support the theory of evolution. And this is an Archaeopteryx, this kind of transition organism between dinosaurs and modern day birds, right? And so organisms that are now extinct resemble extant or living organisms that are present here. And so, the idea that dinosaurs or that modern day birds evolved from dinosaurs, the evidence that supports that is that there is the presence in the fossil record of these organisms that kind of look like a dinosaur transforming or transitioning into a modern day bird. And so, these findings of these fossils that existed, or these organisms that existed in the fossil record around the time of the dinosaurs, that had feathers, that look like what we understand to be modern day birds, is strong evidence to support the idea that modern day birds evolved from this large group of dinosaurs that were here. More evidence of the fossil record and the progression of life on this planet. The idea that all animal life originated in the oceans, and eventually those aquatic organisms began to come onto land, then we should see evidence of another transition organism, an amphibious organism that existed. And so we can see that with this fossil here, which is the name was given Tiktaalik. Okay, and so more recently extinct organisms more closely resemble extant species than organisms that died out a much longer time ago. Okay, and see here is an artist's rendition of what this organism looked like, and it kind of looks like a crocodile, salamander, fish sort of organism, and it appears in the late Devonian period, about 375 million years ago, which was about when fossil organisms begin to show up in terrestrial environments, in environments that were not completely aquatic. And you can see it is an organism that you would think would exist in an aquatic environment, and these fins are actually kind of lobed and they're a little bit more solid. Okay, and so this organism would have spent a fair amount of time, most of its time in the water, but that water would have been shallow. You can see the eyes on the top of the head so that it can look up out of water. And so again, the fossil record is full of these transitional organisms that point to the progression and evolution of life. Okay, we can look at the biogeographic evidence that supports evolution and the distribution of phenotypes of organisms that reflect a temporal pattern of change. Okay, and so unique organisms only found in isolated areas, and then the relatedness of organisms across wide spaces. So oftentimes these isolated organisms have features that serve a specific purpose in the environment. And so we can look at human evolution. We can look at the evolution of hominid species across the globe. And here is a picture of two skulls. The one on the right is a Homo sapiens skull, and the one on the left is actually a full-grown hominid species that was found in what's now the Papua New Guinea, Southeast Asian region. And this is a species of hominid that grew to only about 4 feet tall. But the reason, the way that scientists know that this organism this hominid was full grown is looking at the teeth, right? And so if you've ever seen the skull of a human being that hasn't lost all of its teeth and grown, it hasn't lost all of its baby teeth, you can see the adult teeth that are developing inside the jaw. And this skull on the left didn't have those, and that's how scientists knew that it was a hominid species. And so, these differences in the biogeography of related species is other evidence for evolution. And then more evidence, we can compare the anatomy of different organisms and see how they're related and how small changes based on a basic design is evidence for evolution. So we can look at things like homologous structures. So these would be structures of organisms across different species that have one evolutionary origin, but they are designed and function differently, right? And so this is the idea that structures of organisms across species, and I'll give an example in just a little bit, are built off of the same basic platform, the same basic components, but those components are slightly different to serve a different function. Right, so it's sort of like this idea of having a box of Legos, and all these species have the same Legos, but they're configured in different ways. All right, and that points to the fact that the blueprint itself is evidence of a common ancestor, and then the different ways in which that blueprint or those raw materials are constructed is evidence of change from one original design. And so this sort of antithesis structures that we see are analogous structures, parts with different evolutionary origins that are designed and functioned similarly. And so this would be the result of similar environmental pressures taking different raw materials to build essentially the same structure, right? And so this would be, an example of like building a house with wood, out of all wood, or building a house out of stone, right? So different materials coming from different sources, but are to build a structure that is essentially the same. So it can be a little bit confusing about keeping these two definitions separate. So here is an example of the two. So these are all the forelimbs of different mammal species, right? We have a human, cat forelimb, a whale forelimb, and a bat forelimb. And all of these structures look different, and they serve different functions. But as you can see from the color coding, they all contain the same components, right? The same bones. They're just shaped differently, right? There's a humerus, there's a radius and an ulna. There are carpals, metacarpals, and phalanges. And you can see, based on the different organisms and the way that these organisms functioned, those different parts are shaped differently. So this is an example of a homologous structure, right? Same raw materials, shaped differently to serve different functions, okay? And so that's the labels for these different parts of the bone, but they're all the same essential bones, just shaped a little bit differently. Here is an example of an analogous structure. So these are two different eyes in distantly related organisms. And on the left, you have the vertebrate eye. And on the right, you have the octopus eye or the cephalopod eye. All right. And so vertebrates and the invertebrate cephalopods are very distantly related organisms, right? We do share a common ancestor with cephalopods, but it's way back in evolutionary time. Whereas these four mammal species up here, they're more closely related. And so there's been less time to make changes between the two different species, which is why their forelimbs are all off of the same material. But with an analogous structure, we see that we end up with the same structure, but the components are a little bit different, and the way that they're built are a little bit different. And without getting into too much detail, the vertebrate eye is differently constructed in perceiving light, in such that the nerve endings that come off of the light sensing cells actually are more forward in the vertebrate eye than they are in the cephalopod eye. And this is why vertebrates have a blind spot in their eyes, and cephalopods don't, because all of these nerve ending cells, these parts of the nerve endings, actually have to come forward and then go back into the brain. And so in this spot where they're leaving, and part 3 is the optic nerve, where they're leaving the eye where the light is collected and perceived, there can't be any photoreceptive cells in this portion as these nerve endings are leaving. And so that's why vertebrate eyes have a blind spot. But in cephalopods, and I would argue that the cephalopod eye is a more highly functioning eye because it doesn't have a blind spot. The cell recepting cells are on this front part, and so the light signals that pass into the eye just travel in one direction straight to the brain. Okay? But in a vertebrate eye, the light comes in, it has to bounce off the back of the eye and then come forward and then go back into the brain. And that's why there is a blind spot in vertebrate eyes. Okay? And so this is an example of an analogous structure, two very distantly related organisms having the same structure that is built a little bit differently. Okay? More evidence for evolution. We can look at comparative embryology, looking at the ways in which different organisms develop, either in the womb or as within an egg, or as they are developing and growing and being independent. Okay, and so we can see that distantly related organisms have similar developmental stages. So if we look at the embryos of a bunch of different species here, and so moving across from left to right, we can see the different developmental stages. So this column is for fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, pig, cow, rabbit, and human. We can see at this early developmental stage, all of these embryos look very, very similar. Okay. And because human beings are more closely related to rabbits and cows, when we go to this next developmental stage, we can see that humans and rabbits and cows and pigs, all of these mammal species, they're beginning to differentiate, but they still look very similar. But then when we look at a bird or a turtle, there's still some similarities, but there is the bird and the turtle look more similar to each other than they do to these 4 mammal species. And then when we look at fish and salamanders, we really begin to see a difference, okay, in their development. And then on this last developmental stage, we really begin to see some more differences. But even looking at these 4 mammal species, there's a lot of similarity between the way that they look, okay? And so this is one way that we can tell that they're who's more closely related to whom. But because of the similarity that we see early on, that's more evidence that we're all evolving from a common ancestor, right? It's a very similar blueprint that slowly differentiates when we look at different species. All right, and of course, more recent evidence in the last century or two, looking at molecular biology and comparative DNA analysis, right? So we can see more evidence of similarities just by virtue of the fact that all living organisms that we know of have DNA and use DNA as a means of surviving and replicating and determining what traits that we have. Okay, and so the species blueprints are very, very similar. And so when we look at the chromosomes of human beings, Homo sapiens and chimpanzees, we can see really, really, really stark similarities between our two species. And many of you have heard that Homo sapiens and chimpanzees and bonobos are often left out from that conversation, and I'll explain why that is in next week's lecture. But human beings and chimps and bonobos share 99% of our DNA. But what's interesting is that human beings have 23 chromosomes, 23 pairs of chromosomes, and chimpanzees and bonobos have 24. And so when we look at the second chromosome in human beings and the second and third chromosomes in chimpanzees, what was recently discovered is that the second chromosome in human beings actually looks like a fused second and third chromosome in humans in chimpanzees and bonobos, right? So this very seemingly small change in DNA resulted in a very large difference between hominids, Homo sapiens, and chimpanzees, and was likely the thing that differentiated our two lineages way back several million years ago, that has given rise to our different extant species, right? So it's evidence that we are very closely related, and that the changes that we see, the physical changes that we see between our three species, are present in the physical differences in our DNA. Okay, and so these are different ways of explaining the diversity of life, explaining the relatedness, what species are related to what species. But then, of course, the question is, like, how does all of this happen, right? And so this is a picture of a silky chicken. Some of you might know what this is. This is a silky chicken, a chicken that has feathers that kind of look like hair. They're really interesting. Most silky chickens have black skin, right? And so, like, how do you get this organism, or how do you get some of the more bizarre organisms, bizarre to human beings on this planet? How do these traits evolve? How do these things come to be? All right. And so that's the topic of what we're going to be talking about in the subsequent weeks, the mechanisms of evolution. And I mentioned this before at the beginning of this lecture, that there are different ways in which evolution can happen. And the one that's most well understood, most well researched, and the one that oftentimes gets conflated with all of evolution, or all the ways that evolution happens, is natural selection, this theory that Charles Darwin and Alfred Wallace developed. It's the most studied mechanism of evolution. Here's a very famous example of Darwin's finches, and how he explained natural selection. And so you have an original founding species of finches that came to the Galapagos Islands, and over time this founding population grew, and different sections of that population began to specialize on different food sources, and over time they became more and more specialized, and their traits changed to take advantage of the different niches that were available, the different opportunities for members of that population to feed. And so you can look across the different beak shapes and beak sizes, and those beak shapes and beak sizes, like Aristotle observed many years before, have a specific function, right? The reason why this finch has a really long beak is so that it could feed on nectar of trees. And the reason why this finch had a very thick beak was that to be able to feed on and crush seeds that were available on the island, right? And so natural selection is a really well-researched mechanism of evolution. It is not the same as evolution, right? It's a way in which evolution happens, so it's important to make that distinction. And it is one process by which we see these different traits. But differences in traits can happen through natural selection, through environmental pressures, but it can also happen through mutations, right? So these are spontaneous changes in the genes, and we can think about, those of you who know about X-Men and mutants, right? The mutants exist because of these random changes, and they're not really predictable. They're not really something that we can, know is going to happen. And they're just sort of like things that mutations in organisms that result in changes. And so mutations, oftentimes human beings tend to pay attention to the mutations that result in very big changes or very noticeable changes, but they don't always have to be big changes, but they're simply random, spontaneous changes in the genes of an organism. So it could be, something as simple as, one base pair in your DNA being changed, and that not really having any impact, or a couple of base pairs being changed, and all of a sudden you're growing a third eye instead of having two eyes, right? The last mechanism of evolution is the least well understood by most people who are being introduced to evolution, and that's genetic drift. And it's slightly different it's different than mutation. We're talking about random changes or stochastic changes in the gene frequencies within a population. And so mutations happen at the level of the individual, these spontaneous changes in the individual's DNA. And genetic drift, we're talking about random changes in the overall population, or the frequencies of population, gene frequencies within a population. And so we can think of, a population of human beings, and let's say that there are 100 human beings, and of those 100 human beings, 90 have brown eyes. And we know that dark pigment for eye color in human beings is a dominant trait. And so we would expect over time, as long as the environment changes and there's no sort of pressure or evolutionary advantage for lighter colored eyes, that we would expect over time for the population to have about 90% of those individuals with brown eyes. But what happens in genetic drift is, we get a random change in the gene frequencies, in which maybe over time there are, instead of 90% of the population having brown eyes, 50% of the population has brown eyes. And it's not because of any environmental factors per se that eliminated brown-eyed individuals, or not because having lighter colored eyes meant you produced more offspring, but it's simply a random change in the gene frequencies within a population, a random roll of the dice. And for a random reason, you would end up with more blue-eyed individuals than you would expect. Okay, and so that's genetic drift. So the important thing to remember, the difference between mutation and genetic drift, is that mutation happens at the level of the individual, these random changes, and genetic drift happens at the level of the population, these random changes in the gene frequencies. Okay, and so that's all for this week in terms of the introduction for evolution, a shorter lecture. But it's important to really sit with these ideas, to remember why evolution is misunderstood, what evolution is saying, the realm of science, why talking about a belief in evolution is not actually a scientifically valid rebuttal to the theory, what evolution is saying and what it is not saying, and then these different mechanisms of evolution, how it happens, and we're going to go into more detail in the next lecture. Okay, so the question of the week that I want you all to answer and turn in, and please remember that you need to be staying on top of these, okay? So this question of the week is, I want you to define evolution. So it actually isn't a question, it's a command, but define evolution. Define natural selection. See, I'm already sort of in that pattern. I've been socialized to think that they are the same thing. So define natural selection, which is different than evolution. And turn that in and get that in before next week's slides lecture are released. Okay, so a couple of more things before I sign off. Remember to keep up to date with the podcasts and your readings and things like that. So this week, you're going to be listening to a coronavirus episode on the podcast Ologies, which is one of my favorite podcasts. And I think it's really important to be thinking about this virus, the pandemic, within the context of evolution. And this episode does a really good job of putting it into that context. Okay, so you want to remember to stay on top of that. Turn in your reflections by Sunday night, sorry. to make sure that you're on top of that. So there will be a reflection on eCampus that accompanies this podcast. So remember to answer those questions thoroughly and do your listening. And the last thing I want to say is, today, this past week has been pretty interesting. I'm sure many of you saw, and hopefully, you all weren't participating in this. The line outside of the bars downtown and people sort of in close proximity, not wearing masks and those sorts of things. And so I expect, as many health experts expect, as many university officials expect, as many people expect, for the numbers of people with coronavirus who have been diagnosed and had positive tests to increase. And so it's really important to stay safe, to use your personal protective gear when you're out and about, and certainly when you're in public spaces, and certainly when you're indoors, to follow those protocols that the university has set out, and to follow those protocols that are being followed throughout the country, so that we can actually get a handle on this and we can get back to normal. Or get back to how we are used to functioning in terms of being in person and those sorts of things. So please stay safe. Another thing is check on your friends and family. It's really important to do that because we're in a time where people feel very isolated, particularly if you are a student who is diagnosed or has a positive corona test. You end up having to spend a lot of time by yourself, and that can be really hard. And I think that, with this pandemic and having to be, socially isolated from a lot of people, that's another way in which this pandemic is really taking a toll. So please, please, please check on your friends and family. Stay in regular contact with them. You never know how just getting a phone call from somebody, or, checking in, sending a picture, remind somebody that you're thinking about them and that you care about them, is going to be especially important in this time. Okay. And the last thing is to be gentle with yourself. We all have responsibilities that we need to stay on top of. But these are really especially difficult times for everyone. And I think it's important to maybe lower our expectations with still meeting our responsibilities and still meeting our goals. But to not beat ourselves up for not doing everything that we normally would do. Okay, so be gentle with yourself. Really try to be conscientious of taking time to connect with people, connect with the things that bring you joy and happiness, and to try to not take yourself too seriously and relieve some of the pressure that we may be feeling on ourselves. Okay, and so be gentle with yourself, check on your friends and family, check on yourself, and just stay safe. Okay? So I will see you all again, or not see you all, but I'll talk to you all again next week. Please stay up with the readings and the assignments. Communicate with me if there's anything that comes up. I'm here to work with you if you're going through, difficult or challenging times and having trouble meeting assignments. And stay tuned for the next week's Organism of the Week. I've got a really good one lined up. All right. So I'll talk to you all again in 1 week. Take care.